Hi, I'm Clem. I run a very small blog called Clem's Recipe Reviews, where I take recipes that I find from, say, the internet or from one of my cookbooks that I have because I'm a recipe addict, or even the back of a food packet, and I test them out. So today, for my very first video, I'm going to do a green bean casserole done by the famous Paula Deen. Now, if you haven't heard of Paula Deen, she is a American woman from the South who loves to cook with butter. She makes some very good recipes, and her hair seems to defy gravity the older she gets. Anyway, she's a great cook. If you want to check her out, definitely have a look. She does some amazing stuff. Anyway, so she does a green bean casserole. Now, green bean casserole is a traditional casserole dish that you can find for Thanksgiving or for Christmas in the U.S. It's, the name says, it's green beans, but with a lot of American dishes, it's green beans plus something else. But it's a great side dish to any one of your Sunday roasts or your holiday meal. Anyway, let's get to it. So a green bean casserole obviously has green beans, and Paula Deen does 2 cups of green beans, half a cup of sliced onions, half a cup of mushrooms, and also cream of mushroom soup and some fried onions as well. So the fried onions are onions that are essentially, they're really crunchy and they're deep fried. You can't really find them here in Australia. It's actually really, really difficult, next to impossible. But there is actually a really good alternative, is fried shallots. You can find those in an Asian supermarket. You can even find them in Woolies and Coles, I'm sure, in the international food aisle. The recipe also calls for a pinch of house seasoning. Paula Deen does have a recipe for that, but you really could just use seasoned salt if you wanted to, or your own regular house seasoning. Because I'm from Virginia, I use Old Bay seasoning. If you can find it, get a jar of it. You will not regret it at all. It is so good on popcorn, chicken, vegetables. It's good on pretty much anything. And seriously, you have to find it if you can. And also it calls for butter. Paula Deen is the butter woman. She loves butter. And you know what? I like butter too. Anyway, let's get started. So the key to the Clem's Recipes Reviews is to test out a recipe. So I'm going to make Paula Deen's version, and then we're going to see what works, what doesn't, and see if we need to modify the recipe. So Paula Deen starts with the green beans, and she boils them for 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and drop them in 3 cups of chicken stock as per her recipe, and set my timer. Okay, and then next she says to melt the butter and saute the onions and mushrooms. Alright, so butter is going in. Now she says 1/3 of a stick of butter, and on my blog I'll actually convert any imperial measurements to metric for you, because you know what, the biggest gripe that I have with a lot of recipes is that they don't show both types of measurements. It's really annoying, especially when you're living in a country that uses metric, which is essentially pretty much the entire world except for the US and a couple of other countries. So I'll put that on my blog as well, just that way it makes it a lot easier for you guys when you read it. Alright, so butter is melting. And in go the onions and the mushrooms. Now, she just says to saute these until they get softened up, so hopefully that'll be about the same amount of time as it takes for the green beans to boil up. Okay, my timer's gone off. I've actually drained my green beans. Now, Paula doesn't say anything about how well to drain them. She also doesn't put them in an ice bath either to keep that green color. So, you know, if you're using fresh green beans, maybe you want to put them in an ice bath. I don't know. Maybe that's something that we'll try out in the second test. which I'll probably do offline, just that way, because you don't want to see me repeat the same recipe, twice, which is one of the rules that I do on the blog. Anyway, so the onions have sauteed and the mushies as well, and as you can see, they're actually a nice golden color. I've had to lower the heat because they did cook actually a lot faster than the green beans did. So maybe what should be the first step should be green beans first, boil those down, and then actually do the onions and such. That way you can have the green beans have time to drain really well. Okay, so green beans are going to go in, as well as the cream of mushroom soup, your fried onions or your fried shallots, which I have measured out to the amount that Paula Deen has said to measure out, and then also your pinch of your house seasoning. Okay, and then you mix all of that up. So for starters, what I'm seeing here already, and I'll just tilt the pan so that you can see it as well, is that this is a lot of cream of mushroom soup in comparison to the amount of green beans. This is almost like cream of mushroom soup topped with green beans. So when I do the second test, I'll actually just double check and make sure that I did have the exact measurements as per her recipe. And then, obviously we'll test it out with the taste test. Okay, so she says to mix it up, which is what we've done, and now we're going to put it in our baking dish, and then we're going to stick it in the oven. So Paula Deen asked for a 1.5 quart baking dish, but I'll tell you now, I haven't seen one before. So just use, the next one that size that you've got, which is a 2 quart. I think I found this at Kohl's or Woolies. Seriously, it's like $10 or something, really cheap. So just going to pour these in. Yep, just going to level it out, and I'm going to stick it in the oven. Timer's going off. Go ahead and take this bad boy out. Alright, that is what the casserole looks like when you get it out of the oven. It's pretty natural to have all the bubbles around it and everything, but we're not finished yet. We do have to sprinkle on the cheese. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And Paula Deen calls for 1 cup of cheese, which seems to be almost the perfect proportion ratio to this size casserole. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and stick that bad boy back in the oven. Now, here in Australia, the proportions are actually different, apparently, when it comes to tinned soup. So here it says 420 grams, but in Paula Deen's recipe she says 10 3/4 can of cream of mushroom soup, which converts to about 300 grams, which means you only need to use 2/3 of a can, which I discovered and which I tried in the second test. Obviously the consistency is very different. This one here, because this is the first test that I'm showing you, it looks like it's a lot more soupy. So I'll actually show you a really quick image in a minute about what the second test actually looks like. So yeah, so that's actually one thing I've discovered, and unfortunately I think that's really unrealistic as well. Okay, I know I said that I wasn't going to show you guys a second test, but seeing as the Camel soup cans are actually a different weight in Australia compared to the US, figured it is actually worth doing a second test because, one test, you can always figure out if there's human error. Second one, you can actually work out the kinks. So anyway, I'm up to the point where you need to mix the green beans and the soup. Now, with the soup, I did measure it out on my weight scale, and it's actually come dead on to 1 cup. That means that there's about a quarter of the tin of the soup still in there, which I'm sorry, but that's just a waste. All right, so soup is going in. That's also another dish that I need to clean up, which, if you know me well enough, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of cleaning up, but you know, when it comes to cooking, I love making a mess. Alright, so that's in. Green beans are in. Putting in our pinch of seasoning. And fried onions. And we're mixing that up. So, now that I've got the right amount of soup mix in proportion to everything else in the recipe, I'm still looking at it and it's still a lot of soup. So Paula Deen actually does a video of this on her website, and it's really not that, like, it's not this thick, which I'm wondering what exactly has gone on. But you know what? Show must go on. If I've done this recipe exactly according to the instructions, I've figured out, you know, what the actual proportion of soup is and stuff, you know, maybe it's actually, the recipe is slightly different to what's been instructed. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to put this in the oven, and then we'll test both of them out. Okay, so second one's out, and as you can see, this is actually only about 2 minutes after it's been out, and we don't have all the bubbles around it, and it also seems like it's actually a bit, I think the casserole dish itself, the shape and the depth of it actually has worked in our favor. So I think at this stage I would recommend, instead of using a square casserole dish, if you have an 8x11 casserole dish like this one is, it probably would work a lot better for the recipe. Anyway, we've got to put the cheese on, and then we'll put it back in the oven for a few minutes, and then we'll test them out. Okay, so test 1, test 2. Already you can see a huge difference, like, you know, you can see a lot more of the green beans in the second casserole dish compared to the first one. Again, though, there is still that fat that's coming up at the top. I'm pretty sure at this stage that that's just the milk fat from the cheese. I'm not concerned about that. Alright, we already know that if you're going to go and put a condensed cream soup into a recipe, you're going to have this stick to your ribs. This is not a healthy casserole dish. Frankly, I don't care. If you're using this for the holidays, it's not going to really matter. Anyway, so the other difference is the depth. I mean, you can see how thick the first one is by comparison to the second one. This one's still really hot, so yeah, and it's still a bit runny as well. But yeah, you can see how thin that is, where if you've got quite a few people coming, I would say the second one, using, again, that 8x11 casserole dish, which is actually a 2.2 quart casserole dish, would actually work in your favor, because then actually you could actually serve a bit, I guess a bit less, or you could actually divide this into probably serving about 6 people, maybe 8 if you're giving very small proportions. But anyway, let's try a taste test. Again, the first one uses a full Australian can of cream of mushroom soup, so this actually we already know is going to be very soupy, I guess, compared to the second one where it does actually use the 10 3/4 ounce / 304 grams of cream of mushroom soup like the recipe actually calls for, which is something we didn't really discover until, you know, we figured out that the tin sizes are actually different in both countries. Anyway, let's try these out. Okay, I'm going to try the first one. Okay, it's not bad, but it is definitely like a cream of mushroom soup casserole instead of a green bean casserole. It's I can feel the grease going through my mouth as well. It is just so much butter for this casserole dish. It's also, you don't really taste the house seasoning, so I think unfortunately with that amount of soup, it actually overpowers the taste. You don't even really taste the green beans or the mushrooms. The other thing is that this calls for mixing in the fried onion. I think that does give a bit of an added flavor, like there is a bit of a hint of an oniony flavor, but they're really soft, so this is like a really, really soft casserole dish. I think you would want a bit of crunch in it, and a lot of the really all true traditional green bean casserole recipes actually do have the fried onions on the top, or a bread crumb or something like that. So that's one thing I would say with this dish is maybe actually put the fried onions on the top to give that added crunch. Alright, so on to the second one. So yeah, so this, with that actual proportion, that correct proportion of the soup, you do definitely get a lot more of the green beans in it. Okay, that's definitely not that bad, but I think it has the same problems as the first try we did, where the fried onions don't really come through. It does give a much more oniony flavor. If you want that in there, go ahead, by all means, but I think it needs a bit of a crunch on the top. So I reckon after putting the cheese, you put the onions on. I think that's one thing you have to do with this recipe. It would just give such a better dimension to the whole dish itself. I think actually the amount of soup that you've got is not bad, but I would actually put in more green beans if you're going to use that. And at the same time, who's going to go and want to measure, 3/4 of a tin of soup and put in 1 cup and then not be able to use that 1 cup? If you're in a country that has a 420 gram tin of soup, use all of it. So that's what I'm going to do with my version of this recipe, or my alternative version of this recipe, where I've tested all of these out, and I'm going to make it so that it, to me, is much better, and it's actually a much stronger recipe as well. That'll definitely wow the crowd. Okay, so I'm going to do my version of this recipe, or my improvements, recommendations on this. So Paula Deen uses fresh green beans. That's fine. I've been using snap frozen because there's 0 difference, because your green beans are going to get boiled. It doesn't really matter. But instead of using 2 cups, I've used 4 cups. Because this is a green bean casserole, you want the green beans to shine. They are the star of this dish. It's not the soup, it's not the mushrooms or whatnot. Mushrooms have a very mild flavor to me, so I've actually also doubled that amount, so instead of half a cup, it's 1 cup. I've kept the onions as is in measurement, so there's still only half a cup of onions. But to give the whole dish a little bit of depth and a little extra flavor, I've added some garlic. What you could do, if you can find it, is you could put in a bit of deep fried garlic, so the same thing as the deep fried shallots. They're a little bit sweeter, but the garlic flavor is a lot stronger. So that would probably give a good dimension, but just be careful on the amount that you do, because you don't want the whole dish to taste like garlic. The other thing I'm going to do is, instead of just doing a pinch of house seasoning, I'm going to put probably say about a teaspoon of seasoning. I think it's enough in terms of actually getting that extra flavor. Now, again, I'm using Old Bay. It's an all seasoning sort of mix. If you want to create your own so that you can control the salt, I would suggest you probably try a little bit of celery salt and maybe some paprika, salt and pepper, especially white pepper, because it's a bit stronger than regular pepper. Anyway, I'm going to cook this up and then create the casserole dish, and then we will taste test all 3 again. So my version of Paula Deen's recipe is out of the oven. What I've also done differently, instead of putting in the fried shallots or the fried onions within the actual casserole and stirring it through before baking it, I've actually put them on top. The reason for that is because I think it actually needed a bit of crunch, because casserole is quite soft in a way with all the textures, because obviously green beans don't stay crunchy when you cook them. Same thing with mushrooms and onions and such. Anyway, so with the first one, again, what the problem that we had was is that it was actually more of a cream of mushroom soup casserole, and we discovered that the actual amount of soup in a tin here in Australia is actually very different to what's in the US. So the second one is actually, full tests again. We do 2 tests because we want to make sure that there's not human error or anything going on. It was a little bit better. We also used, instead of, saying we use a 2-quart pan or, 1.5-quart pan like Paula Deen recommended, we tried using a bit of a shallower dish instead of the square to make that, the casserole layer itself a bit thinner. But that way also you can actually spread it across more people. And also just to see, like if it's a difference of pan that actually, would improve this recipe. So again, that one was a bit more still of the cream of mushroom soup casserole. The other thing that we found with the Paula Deen recipe is that there's a lot of butter. And yes, she is the butter queen, and I'm all for that, but you don't want that to get in the way of the dish itself. And my whole mouth was swimming in butter. It wasn't that good. So anyway, so I've cut the butter by half in my version. So anyway, here goes nothing. Let's go ahead and try it out. So I don't know if you can see it, but it's definitely a lot less soup within the casserole itself. You can definitely taste the house seasoning when you add a teaspoon of it instead of just a pinch. And the green beans actually seem like they are definitely the star of the dish as well. Oh yeah. Adding that garlic and a bit more of that house seasoning definitely makes this stand out. And it seems like it's now more of an even playing when it comes to the vegetables and the cream of mushroom soup. It's not one that's more than the other. So I will put the recipe on my blog, and I'll also write down all my reviews and stuff. That way you guys can take your time, you can pace yourself, and see what works and what doesn't for you. If you have any recommendations of recipes you want me to try, I'm happy to be your guinea pig and try them out for you and tell you what works and what doesn't.